Some desires root themselves so deeply, they become part of the land itself, a quiet, insistent ache for belonging. This is a story of such a longing, not born of grand gestures or desperate flight, but woven into the quiet rhythm of shared breath and careful hands, until two solitary lives became a single, sturdy home. The dust in Redemption, Montana, tasted of solitude and dry earth. Elias Thorne knew its flavor well. His days were a measured procession. The precise firing of the forge, the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil, the scent of coal smoke mingling with the sharp tang of his own sweat. He was a man shaped by the frontier's hard lessons, his frame broad, his movements economical, his gaze steady and deep-set. His cabin, a stout structure of rough-hewn logs, stood a little apart from the nascent town, echoing the distance he kept from most folk. Inside, everything had its place. A pot of coffee simmered perpetually on the hearth, its aroma a meager comfort in the otherwise stark space. His bed, a cot in the corner, was always tightly made, a testament to an order he imposed on a world that often felt chaotic. He ate his meals in silence, watching the shadows lengthen outside his single window, the quiet hum of the wind through the pines often his only companion. The loneliness wasn't a gaping wound, but a constant, dull throb beneath the surface of his disciplined existence. It was the quiet expectation that no one would ever truly settle beside him, that his careful routine would forever be his only solace. He hadn't sought connection in years, having learned that such things often brought more pain than peace. He was a protector by nature, but who was there to protect in a life so utterly self-contained? His hands, calloused and strong, ached for purpose beyond the shaping of metal, a tenderness he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. He had just finished a particularly stubborn horseshoe, the smell of burnt hoof still clinging to the air, when a knock came at the forge door. It was Silas, the owner of the general store, his brow furrowed. "Elias, I need a favor. Big one." Elias wiped his hands on a rag, his expression unreadable. Silas rarely asked for favors. "There's been a mistake. A booking error at the boarding house. The stagecoach brought a woman, Miss Ada Finch, from back east, looking for a caretaker position the Reverend advertised. But Mrs. Henderson's already full, and there's no room for her, not even in the annex." Elias waited, his gaze unwavering. He knew where this was headed. "She's got nowhere to go, Elias, and winter's coming." Reverend thought, "Well, your cabin's got 2 rooms, right? You use one for storage." Elias's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A woman in his cabin. The very idea disrupted the carefully constructed solitude he'd built around himself. "I keep to myself, Silas." I know, but she seems a quiet sort, and she's desperate. Paid for her passage all this way, just for a few weeks, until something else opens up, or the Reverend finds her a proper situation. He'd pay you for her keep." Elias looked out at the darkening sky. The thought of a stranger in his space, intruding on his quiet, was anathema. Yet the image of a woman, alone and adrift in redemption, stirred something in him, a flicker of that buried need to protect. He thought of his mother, long gone, and the unspoken code he lived by. "How quiet," he finally grunted. Silas brightened. "Quiet as a field mouse, Elias. Honest, she's got a small trunk, keeps herself to herself, and she needs work. Maybe she could help with the chores?" Reverend said she was seeking work as a housekeeper or seamstress. Elias sighed, a barely audible expulsion of air. "Bring her. Tell her the conditions. She keeps her room. I keep mine. No bother." It wasn't a welcome, not truly, but it was an acceptance. Silas clapped him on the shoulder, relief evident. "You're a good man, Elias. She'll be here by dusk." Ada Finch arrived as the last streaks of orange faded from the sky, a small figure silhouetted against the deepening twilight. She carried a single worn satchel, her trunk evidently still with Silas. Her eyes, He noted even in the dim light were a remarkable shade of hazel, wide and intelligent, assessing her surroundings with a quiet intensity that belied her seemingly delicate frame. Her dress, though plain, was well maintained, and her hands, clasped in front of her, were slender but looked capable. She wasn't what he'd expected, no simpering helplessness, no demanding airs, just a quiet resilience that mirrored his own. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice soft but clear, like the rustle of dry leaves. Silas explained the situation. "I'm grateful for your hospitality." He nodded, opening the cabin door wider. The air inside, usually stagnant with his own scent, seemed to shift, to anticipate. "The room at the back," he gestured with his chin. "Used for storage. Clear it out by morning." She simply nodded again, stepping across the threshold, bringing with her a faint scent of lavender and something else, something clean and hopeful. He watched her move, her movements graceful despite the weariness etched around her eyes. She placed her satchel on the floor of the small room, then turned to him. "I'll need to fetch my trunk from the store, and perhaps find a broom." He pointed to a corner. "Broom's there. I'll get your trunk later." He noticed the faint trembling in her hands as she unwrapped a shawl from her shoulders. She was tired, and perhaps a little afraid, but she masked it well. The silence that fell between them wasn't awkward, but a careful, almost respectful space. It was the silence of two wary creatures, circling each other, assessing. He left her to her preparations, retreating to his own corner by the hearth, stoking the fire until its warmth filled the cabin, pushing back the encroaching chill of the evening. He listened to the soft rustle of her movements, the gentle thud of a box being moved, the almost imperceptible sigh as she finally sat down in her room. His solitude was broken, but not shattered. Not yet. He brought her trunk back later, the canvas surprisingly light, a testament to how little she truly possessed. He left it by her doorway, not wanting to intrude further. The next morning, the cabin felt different. The coffee was already brewing, its rich scent mingled with the aroma of freshly baked bread. He found Ada in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled to her forearms, her face smudged with flour. She looked up, startled, then offered a small, hesitant smile. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne. I hope you don't mind. I found some flour and thought a proper breakfast would be welcome." Her voice, in the quiet of the morning, felt like a caress. He grunted, taking his usual seat at the small table. He hadn't expected this. His breakfasts were usually a sparse affair of hardtack and coffee. She placed a plate before him, thick slices of golden brown bread, butter, and a small dish of berry preserves. Simple, yet it felt like an offering. "I can pay for the provisions," she added quickly, as if sensing his unspoken thought. "Silas gave me a small advance for my work with the Reverend, though the Reverend hasn't quite found me steady employment yet." He dipped a piece of bread into the preserves. "No need. You're here. Eat." He watched her as she moved about the small kitchen, efficient and graceful. She didn't hover, didn't try to force conversation. She simply existed in the space, a quiet, gentle presence. The bread was warm, soft, and tasted of home. He hadn't realized how much he missed such simple comforts. Days turned into a quiet rhythm. Ada, finding little immediate work with the Reverend, began to fall into the domestic routine of Elias's cabin. She cleaned with a thoroughness that surprised him, making the rough-hewn interior feel less stark, more welcoming. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the single window, and the scent of beeswax now mingled with the familiar coal smoke. She made the coffee, cooked simple, hearty meals, and mended his worn shirts with surprisingly deft fingers. He'd often find her by the window, a needle glinting in her hand, her brow furrowed in concentration. He never asked about her past, and she never offered. The unspoken agreement was a comfortable silence, a truce born of necessity and a shared respect for solitude. Yet, within that silence, micro-intimacy began to bloom. One evening, he came in from the forge, his hand scraped raw from a stubborn piece of iron. Without a word, she appeared with a basin of warm water and a clean rag, gently washing away the grime before applying a salve she'd concocted from dried herbs. Her touch was light, careful, and utterly without demand. "Hold still," she murmured, her breath warm against his skin. He watched her face, illuminated by the flickering lamplight, and felt a strange warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a new sensation, this quiet, unasked for care. Another time, he found her struggling with a stubborn latch on the woodshed door. He stepped in, his large hand easily securing the mechanism. As he turned, his arm brushed hers. He felt a jolt, a quickening of his pulse, and saw a faint flush rise on her cheeks. She didn't pull away abruptly, but simply shifted, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment, a silent acknowledgment of the spark. The cabin, once a fortress against the world, was slowly becoming a shared space, each quiet gesture a brick laid in a new foundation. He'd noticed how she shivered sometimes in the mornings, despite the roaring fire he kept. He saw her trying to make her thin shawl stretch further around her shoulders. One crisp evening, as the wind howled outside, rattling the windows, he found himself pulling an extra heavier blanket from a storage chest. He paused by the doorway to her room, the thick wool folded neatly over his arm. "Ada," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet. She looked up from the book she was reading by lamplight, her expression a mix of surprise and mild alarm. "It gets cold at night. It's warmer." He offered it, not quite meeting her eyes, his gaze fixed on a knot in the wooden door frame. She looked at the blanket, then at him, her hazel eyes searching his face. He felt a strange vulnerability, an awkwardness he hadn't experienced in years. "Thank you, Elias," she said softly, using his given name for the first time. The sound was a small, intimate caress. She reached out, her fingers brushing his as she took the blanket. Her touch was fleeting, but it lingered, a ghost of warmth on his skin. He retreated to his own cot, but sleep was slow to come. He could hear the faint rustle of her movements as she settled in, then the soft, steady rhythm of her breathing. The single room of his cabin, divided only by a thin makeshift curtain, felt smaller, more charged with an unspoken presence. He imagined her wrapped in the blanket he'd given her, warm and safe. And for the first time in a long time, the silence of his cabin didn't feel quite so empty. The next afternoon, a rider approached the cabin, his presence stirring the quiet air. Elias was at the forge, and Ada was inside, hanging freshly washed linen by the fire. He heard the horse's hooves and a booming voice. "Thorne, you got a pretty little bird nesting in your cabin, I hear." It was Horace Granger, a man known for his bluster and his sense of entitlement, who owned the largest ranch outside of town. Elias stepped out, wiping his hands on his apron, his expression guarded. Granger was eyeing the cabin door with a proprietary smirk. Heard the Reverend was looking for a caretaker. Didn't realize he'd found such appealing company for you. Elias's jaw tightened. "She's a guest, Granger, and she's looking for work." Granger dismounted, swaggering closer. "Well, I could use a housekeeper, and a wife, for that matter. A pretty thing like her, alone out here. She'd be better off with a man who can provide for her." "You're just a blacksmith, Thorne." Before Elias could respond, Ada stepped out onto the porch, drawn by the loud voices. Her face was pale, but her posture was straight, her chin held high. "Mr. Granger," she said, her voice clear and steady, though Elias noted the faint tremor in her hands. "My arrangements are my own. I am seeking honest work, not a situation." Granger chuckled, a dismissive sound. Now, little dove, don't be shy. A woman needs a man to look after her, and a lonely woman in a lonely man's cabin. Well, people talk, don't they?" His gaze, predatory and leering, swept over Ada, making her flinch. Elias stepped forward, placing himself between Ada and Granger, his bulk a solid wall. "She said her arrangements are her own, Granger. And she's under my roof. You got business with me, state it. Otherwise, leave." His voice was low, dangerous. The air grew tense. Granger's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. He knew better than to push Elias Thorne too far. Elias had a reputation for quiet, unyielding strength. All right, Thorne. Just making an offer. A generous one, I might add. She might change her mind when she realizes what life with a blacksmith really entails." He tipped his hat, a mocking gesture, then remounted his horse and rode off, his laughter echoing in the distance. Ada stood frozen for a moment, then sagged against the doorframe, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Elias turned to her, his expression softening. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before gently, carefully, he placed it on her shoulder. "He's gone," he murmured, his thumb brushing her arm. She nodded, her eyes closed, then slowly opened them, meeting his. "Thank you, Elias," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't have to." He simply squeezed her shoulder, a silent promise. The touch was brief, but it held a world of unspoken protection. That evening, the silence in the cabin was different, heavy with the weight of the earlier confrontation. Ada sat by the hearth, mending a tear in her simple dress, her head bowed. Elias watched her, a knot of unease in his gut. He didn't like the idea of Granger's words unsettling her, of the town gossiping about her. She deserved more than that. He deserved more than that. He cleared his throat. "Ada," he began, and she looked up, her needle poised. "About what Granger said." He paused, searching for the right words. "You don't have to stay here, if it causes you trouble?" Her gaze was steady, unwavering. "Where would I go, Elias? There's nowhere else. And I don't mind it here." She lowered her gaze, her fingers stilling on the fabric. "It's quiet, and I feel safe." The last words were almost a whisper, but they resonated deeply within him. Safe. He hadn't realized how important that was to her, how much it meant. He thought of her hands, trembling earlier, and a fierce protectiveness swelled within him. "I can keep you safe," he said, the words surprising even himself, raw and earnest. He watched her, waiting for a response. She looked up again, her eyes wide, searching his. "I know you can," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "But people will talk. They already are." He nodded, understanding the unspoken implication. It was a small town, and two single people, a man and a woman, living under the same roof, would inevitably invite speculation. "Then we give them something to talk about," he said, his gaze firm, meeting hers. "Stay, not as a guest, not as a charity, but as if this was your home. If you want." He held his breath, the weight of the words hanging in the air. This was an invitation, a vulnerable offering. Her gaze softened, a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. Hope? Relief? "My home?" She repeated, the words tasting foreign on her tongue. "Yes," he affirmed, his voice growing stronger. "If you'll have it, and if you'll have N.E. as a partner, in keeping it." He offered her the silent vow, the unspoken promise of a shared future, a choice made in the quiet warmth of his cabin, a new kind of belonging. From that night forward, the cabin truly became their home. Ada's presence solidified, taking root like a sturdy vine. She rearranged the small sitting area, adding a worn but clean rag rug she found, brightening the space with a small wildflower she'd picked. She began to mend not just his shirts, but also his broken tools, her resourcefulness a quiet marvel. He, in turn, began to leave small offerings for her, a particularly smooth stone he found by the river, a piece of polished wood for her mending basket, a cup of warmer tea set by her elbow without a word. Their conversations, though still sparse, carried more weight, each carefully chosen word a thread in the tapestry of their growing trust. One rainy afternoon, Ada was struggling to carry a heavy bucket of water from the well. Elias, seeing her from the forge, quickly abandoned his work. He took the bucket from her, his fingers brushing hers, and carried it with ease, setting it down gently by the kitchen door. "Let me," he said, his voice a low rumble. She watched him, a small, grateful smile touching her lips. "Thank you, Elias." This small exchange was a repeated pattern, a silent language of care and consideration that grew between them. He watched her hands, so much smaller than his, so capable, as she kneaded dough or polished the worn wooden table. He felt a fierce, tender longing bloom within him, a desire to protect her, to cherish her, to simply be near her. He found himself looking forward to the evenings, to the quiet companionship by the hearth, the shared warmth, the unspoken comfort. The loneliness that had been his constant companion began to recede, replaced by a nascent hope, a gentle yearning. The first hint of a true mutual confession came not in words, but in a shared vulnerability. One blustery evening, a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the cabin, extinguishing the lamp on the table. They were plunged into near darkness, only the faint glow of the dying embers in the hearth providing a meager light. Ada gasped, a small, startled sound. Elias, without thinking, reached across the table, his hand finding hers, his calloused fingers wrapping around her slender ones. Her hand was cold, trembling slightly. "It's just the wind," he murmured, his thumb stroking the back of her hand, a soothing gesture. She squeezed his hand gently in return, a silent acknowledgment of his comfort, her fear easing. In the intimacy of the near darkness, with the storm raging outside, their hands remained clasped, a lifeline, a connection. He felt the warmth spread from her hand into his own, a gentle heat that permeated him. He could feel her pulse, steadying now, beneath his thumb. It was a profound intimacy, born not of words, but of touch, of shared quiet. Later, when he had relit the lamp, the moment was not spoken of, but it lingered, a new current running between them. He saw the shift in her eyes, the way she now met his gaze with a frankness, a quiet challenge that was also an invitation. Their guardedness, once a solid wall, was slowly crumbling, brick by careful brick, revealing the yearning beneath. One frigid night, the temperature outside plummeted, and the cabin, despite the roaring fire, felt impossibly cold. Ada shivered uncontrollably, wrapped in her extra blanket, her teeth chattering. Elias watched her, a deep concern etched on his face. He knew the cot in her room, near the outer wall, was colder than his own, closer to the hearth. He rose, his movements deliberate. "Ada," he said, his voice low. She looked up, her eyes wide with cold. "You're freezing." He paused, gathering his courage. "Come, sleep by the fire. You can take my cot, or we can share the warmth, if you want." He saw the flicker of surprise, then uncertainty, in her eyes. The unspoken question hung in the air, weighted with implication. He met her gaze, his own unwavering. "Only if you want," he reiterated, his voice soft, emphasizing the choice, the consent. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to their clasped hands, still resting on the table from earlier. Then slowly she nodded. I would like that, Elias. The warmth." It was not a grand romantic declaration, but a simple, heartfelt need, an acceptance of his unspoken offer of comfort and safety. He moved to his cot, pulling back the blankets, then stood aside, allowing her to settle in. He then lay down beside her, carefully, leaving a respectable distance between them, a silent acknowledgment of her boundaries. The cot was narrow, and their bodies were close, but not touching. He could feel the warmth radiating from her, a comfort against the biting cold. He lay awake for a long time, listening to her steady breathing, feeling the gentle rise and fall of her chest, a profound sense of peace settling over him. He was no longer alone in the cold, and she, he hoped, was finally warm. The news came through Silas, delivered with a grim expression. Horace Granger, still smarting from his earlier rebuff, had been making inquiries. "He's been asking about Ada's family back east," Silas told Elias, his voice lowered. "And he's found something. Says she's betrothed to a man back in Pennsylvania, a rich merchant. Says her family wants her back for the marriage. Granger's making a fuss, trying to claim she's a runaway, saying he'd be doing her family a service by returning her." Elias's hands clenched into fists. He had suspected something, a reason for her flight to the frontier. He walked back to the cabin, his heart heavy. Ada was humming softly as she kneaded dough, her face flushed with the heat of the hearth. He watched her for a moment. The picture of domestic tranquility and a fierce protectiveness rose within him. He had to tell her. "Ada," he said, his voice rough. She looked up, her hands pausing in their rhythm. He told her everything, keeping his gaze steady, offering no judgment, only facts. Her face drained of color, her hands falling still. "He found me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I ran from that, from a marriage I never wanted. My family. They arranged it. I just couldn't. I couldn't bear it." She looked up at him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, a raw vulnerability exposed. "I thought I was safe here, that I had found a quiet place." He stepped closer, his hand reaching out, this time not hesitating. He cupped her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. "You are safe, Ada. You are safe here with me. I will not let him take you, or anyone." His voice was a solemn vow, a promise forged in the heat of his protectiveness. She leaned into his touch, her eyes searching his, a silent question passing between them. And in that moment, she saw not just a protector, but a partner, a man who saw her, truly saw her, and offered her not just shelter, but a shared future. Granger arrived the next morning, not alone this time. He had brought the local sheriff, a man named Miller, a stoic type who always followed the letter of the law. Ada stood beside Elias, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a silent display of their unity. Granger, emboldened, held up a crumpled letter. "Here, Sheriff, a letter from her father, confirming the betrothal, and a warrant for her return. She's a runaway, a disobedient daughter. Needs to be taken back to her rightful husband." Miller looked from the letter to Ada, then to Elias. Elias stepped forward, his gaze firm. "She is not a runaway. She is a woman who chose her own path, and she has chosen to stay here with me." He looked at Ada, a silent question in his eyes. She met his gaze, then looked at Miller, her voice clear and strong. "I am not beholden to that marriage, Sheriff. I made no vows. I will not be forced into a life I do not want." Miller sighed, clearly uncomfortable. He knew Granger was a powerful man, but he also saw the quiet conviction in Ada's eyes, the unwavering support in Elias's stance. "Miss Finch," Miller began, "the law is complicated with these family arrangements. But if you are here by your own free will, and Mr. Thorne is willing to vouch for you—" Elias interjected, his voice firm. "She is my intended sheriff. We've made our vows to each other, in spirit, if not yet on paper." He looked at Ada, a silent question, an offer. Ada's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise, then a deep, resonant certainty. She looked at Elias, then back at Miller, her grip on Elias's arm tightening. "Yes," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "We are to be married. This is my home now. And Elias is my partner." Granger scoffed. "A blacksmith? She's meant for a merchant." But the words had been spoken. a choice made. Miller looked at Granger, then at the united front before him. The legalities were murky, but the social contract, the public declaration, was clear. "Granger," Miller said, his voice flat, "it appears Miss Finch has made her choice, and Mr. Thorne has made his. The law upholds a woman's right to choose her spouse, especially when no formal vows have been exchanged. I see no grounds for a warrant here." Granger sputtered, outraged, but Miller was already turning away. "My apologies, Miss Finch, Mr. Thorne. I'll be taking my leave." As Miller rode off, Granger stood fuming for a moment. Then, seeing the resolute expression on Elias's face and the defiant strength in Ada's, he stunk to his horse and rode away in a cloud of dust. Elias turned to Ada, his hand still on her arm, his thumb gently stroking her skin. "Is that what you want, Ada?" he asked, his voice low, seeking confirmation, not presuming. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, but this time they were tears of relief, of gratitude. "More than anything, Elias," she whispered, "more than anything." He pulled her gently closer, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight against his broad chest. He could feel the steady beat of her heart against his own, a promise of a shared future. The aftermath of the confrontation was a quiet tenderness that deepened their bond. Ada, still shaken, but resolute, leaned into Elias's strength. He brewed her the warmest tea, held her close as she trembled, and spoke soft, reassuring words against her hair. Later that evening, as he tended to a small cut on her finger, a domestic mishap from their earlier rush to prepare breakfast, the intimacy felt profound. He carefully washed the wound, then applied a salve, his touch feather-light, his gaze intent. She watched his strong hands, usually so powerful with metal, now so gentle with her. "You truly meant it?" she asked, her voice soft, referring to his public declaration. He met her gaze, his eyes dark with earnestness. "Every word, Ada. This is your home, and I want you to be my wife, if you want to be." She nodded, a small, tearful smile blooming on her face. "I do, Elias, I do." He finished bandaging her finger, then slowly lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. It was a gesture of devotion, a silent promise, more powerful than any grand speech. The cabin, once filled with the echoes of his solitude, now hummed with the quiet warmth of their shared future. They ate dinner in the flickering lamplight, a simple meal, but it felt like a feast. He fed her a piece of freshly baked bread, his fingers brushing her lips. She did the same for him, a quiet communion, a new ritual of their devotion. The world outside, with its gossip and its threats, faded into insignificance. Inside, in the soft glow of the lamp, they were building their own world, brick by careful brick, promise by quiet promise. Their wedding was a simple affair, held in the small Redemption Church, witnessed by Silas, the Reverend, and a few close townsfolk who had come to respect Ada's quiet strength and Elias' unwavering devotion. There were no elaborate vows, just plain, heartfelt promises spoken over clasped hands. Later, back in their cabin, now truly their cabin, Ada placed a small, embroidered linen square on his workbench, a delicate bloom stitched into the corner. "A gift," she said, her voice soft, "for our home." Elias, in turn, produced a small, carved wooden bird, smooth and elegant. "For your mending basket," he murmured, his thumb stroking its polished surface. "So you always have something beautiful to hold." They stood in the quiet of their home, surrounded by the familiar objects that had witnessed the slow, tender unfolding of their love. The hearth fire glowed warmly, casting long shadows across the floor. Elias reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his gaze tender, full of a devotion that had finally found its anchor. "Ada," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you are home." She leaned into his touch, her eyes shining. "And so are you, Elias. So are you. Their lips met, a soft, tender kiss, sealing the quiet promise of a shared future. A future of shared routines, of quiet moments, of a love that had grown from necessity into a deep, unwavering devotion. They had found their family, their home, in each other, in the quiet, steady rhythm of their chosen life together in redemption. Their world was small, but it was full, rich with the quiet comfort of belonging, sealed by the promise of two hearts finally at peace.